In early 2011, the world watched something electrifying. Crowds filling streets from Tunis to Cairo to Benghazi, chanting for dignity, democracy, and an end to dictatorships. The story we were given was simple. Ordinary people rising up, regimes collapsing, freedom finally breaking through. But if you looked closely, you could also see something else. Old regime change dreams sliding in underneath the slogans. A set of templates refined in other countries, ready to be dropped onto Libya. In the first two episodes, we saw how Libya went from quiet kingdom to radical oil power to terrorist state under sanctions and airstrikes. In this episode, we're going to follow the story into 2011, when the language switched from fighting terror to protecting civilians, and a new kind of regime change tool set came into play. Before the Arab Spring, there was another wave of uprisings and transitions, usually called color revolutions. Georgia's Rose Revolution, Ukraine's Orange Revolution, the movements in Serbia and elsewhere. Each country had its own local story. Corruption, stolen elections, oligarchs, police brutality. But the playbook had familiar pages. Mass protests centered on symbolic squares, iconic colors and slogans, media-savvy youth groups, NGO networks, and a lot of training in how to push an authoritarian regime to the breaking point without necessarily picking up a gun. Some of this organizing was organic. Some of it was quietly supported, trained, or amplified by outside actors, governments, foundations, and organizations that wanted certain regimes to fall and others to rise. Again, just like we said with terrorism, it's not either or. Local people had real grievances, but powerful states also saw an opportunity. If you can help guide which way the revolution tilts, you don't need tanks to shape a country's future. So by the time the Arab Spring began, there was already a toolbox on the shelf. Techniques, networks, and narratives that could be adapted to the Middle East and North Africa. In late 2010, a street vendor in Tunisia set himself on fire after years of humiliation and harassment. His act of despair sparked nationwide protests, bringing down a long-standing dictator. In Egypt, years of police abuse, rigged elections, and economic frustration exploded into massive protests in Tahrir Square. People watched Mubarak, the seemingly untouchable strongman, forced to resign. These uprisings were real. They were driven by local anger, not foreign scripts. But the way they were framed, and the speed with which outside actors jumped in, followed familiar lines from the Color Revolution era. Western media branded it the Arab Spring, a single wave of democracy sweeping away dictatorships. NGOs and foreign advisors talked about transitions, elections, and constitutional reforms. Suddenly, every country in the region was being measured against one storyline. Are you with the wave or against it? For regimes that had resisted coups and covert operations for decades, this was a new kind of pressure. If you cracked down, you were an enemy of freedom. If you gave in, you risked losing control. And if you had a long history of bad blood with the West, like Libya, that tension became explosive. In February 2011, protests broke out in Libya. They were sparked by arrests, political grievances, and anger at decades of repression and inequality. In cities like Benghazi, crowds attacked police stations and government buildings. The regime responded with force. Very quickly, the narrative hardened. On one side, a brutal dictator willing to massacre civilians to stay in power. On the other, a brave, popular uprising calling for freedom. That framing contained a lot of truth, but it also left out the entire history we've just spent 2 episodes unpacking. Unlike Tunisia or Egypt, Libya wasn't just any Arab country. It was a state that had nationalized its oil, kicked out foreign bases, backed armed movements, and spent decades under sanctions as a terror sponsor. In powerful capitals, some people saw more than just protests. They saw a chance to finish an old job. As the uprising grew, local rebels organized politically and militarily. They set up councils, armed themselves, and claimed to represent the Libyan people. At the same time, foreign media, diplomats, and activists started describing Libya using familiar template language: no-fly zone, responsibility to protect, Benghazi will be a massacre. Look at how fast things moved. In a matter of weeks, the conversation jumped from protests and repression to airstrikes and regime change. That jump is the template in action. Real anger on the ground, plus a ready-made narrative that says the only way to save lives is to remove the regime. Inside Libya, not everyone in the streets was thinking about NATO or UN resolutions. They were thinking about jobs, dignity, revenge, and fear. Outside Libya, powerful actors were thinking about something else: opportunity. When you look back at earlier operations, like the coup against Mossadegh in Iran, or covert pressure in places like Jamaica, the language used was blunt: fighting communism, protecting Western interests, securing access to resources. By 2011, the language had evolved. The key phrase was responsibility to protect, often shortened to R2P. The idea was noble on paper. If a government is about to slaughter its own people, the international community has a duty to step in. In Libya's case, dire warnings about an imminent massacre in Benghazi convinced many that this was one of those moments. A no-fly zone and airstrikes were framed not as regime change, but as protection. But here's the pattern. Once the bombs start falling, once the opposition knows it has powerful air support, the goal tends to shift from protecting civilians where they are to helping the rebels advance and topple a government. Think about it this way. In the old days, you could say, we're overthrowing a hostile regime. In the new language, you say, we're protecting civilians. And if the regime falls in the process, well, that's just how things worked out. Libya became one of the first big tests of this new template. An uprising framed as part of a wave of democratic revolutions, a regime with a long villain file in Western archives, a humanitarian justification used to open the door to military intervention. Behind the scenes, the old concerns were still there: oil contracts, regional influence, sending a message to other governments in the region. But in public, the story was all about saving lives. In episodes 1 and 2, we saw Libya move from independence to defiance to isolation. In this episode, we saw how the Arab Spring and Color Revolution templates created the perfect storm: real protests, deep grievances, and a global narrative ready to turn an uprising into an intervention. In the next episode, we'll look directly at the moment everything snapped: 2011's war, the UN resolution, the NATO bombing campaign, the fall of Tripoli, and the death of Gaddafi. We're going to ask a hard question. If you design an intervention to protect civilians, what happens after the regime falls? Does the protection continue, or does the country get left to bleed? If you're following this series and you want to understand not just what happened to Libya, but how the same playbook appears in different countries, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this episode with someone who still thinks the Arab Spring was just a feel-good democracy story. Drop your thoughts in the comments. When you hear Arab Spring or Color Revolution, do you see pure people power? Or do you see a mix of real revolt and powerful interests riding the wave?